traveling in time, but we're not going to go very far or very far back this time. We're going to go to 1886, and that was the year that was. In January of 1886, Carl Benz patented the Benz patent motorwagen, actually, and it's considered to be the world's first automobile. The original cost of this was $1,000, which would be about $2,600 today. In 1886, Robert Louis Stevenson published Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the great horror story. Dr. Jekyll, the good doctor who was trying to get rid of his bad impulses that he thought he had, gave himself this serum, and when he took the serum, all the evil came out in another persona that called Dr. Hyde, and eventually he couldn't control it, and yeah, great horror story. Sigmund Freud began his practice. I don't know if it had anything to do with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but we have the beginning of psychoanalysis. And in September of 1886, the Apache warrior Geronimo surrendered in Arizona. He had been fighting the US government for almost 30 years to protect the land of the Apaches. He was the last American Indian warrior to surrender to the United States. This is the end of what are known as the Indian Wars. In 1886, Emily Dickinson died. She was 55 years old. At 84, John Deere died. Now, John Deere, who started his career in Vermont, as a blacksmith, made shovels and pitchforks, and then he developed a steel plow blade. And at that point, most American farmers were using wooden plows or iron plows, blades. And, but what John Deere is, I mean, all of you are now thinking green and yellow. John Deere made a major business advance in farm machinery. Before him, plows and other large pieces of machinery were built to order. So if you wanted a plow, you went to someone, you ordered a plow. John Deere said, I'm going to build it and they'll come and buy it. And he took this business risk and made pre-made farm equipment, and the company is still doing well today. A couple of famous births that year. Ty Cobb was born, the baseball player known as the Georgia Peach. He retired with 43 major league career records, including the all-time batting average. And some of those records still stand today. But also saw the birth of Clarence Birdseye. Yes, there really was a Mr. Birdseye, and Mr. Birdseye developed a system of freezing food. And so because of him, you've got your frozen veggies in your freezer. And on October 28th in 1886, the Statue of Liberty was dedicated and opened to the public in the United States. But the idea for the Statue of Liberty began more than 20 years before in France. The idea for the Statue of Liberty came from this man. This is Edouard Le Bouillet. And he was an important political thinker in France, and he was an expert on the US Constitution. He was an abolitionist. He wanted slavery to be abolished. And slavery existed in places other than the United States, and particularly in some of the French colonies. He supported Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. He believed that everybody had a right to freedom. And he spent most of his political career pushing for democracy in France, because France was not a democracy in 1865. In 1865, at the end of the Civil War, he proposed creating a monument for the United States, a gift to the United States. The Union had won the Civil War. It reaffirmed the goals that we had, the ideals of freedom and democracy. And it served, Le Bouillet said that to honor the United States would strengthen the cause of democracy in France, and in fact, the cause of democracy around the world. He he was thrilled that the United States had passed the 13th Amendment, abolished slavery, and he believed that justice and liberty was possible for everyone. And he made this gold coin, really kind of a medal, honoring Abraham Lincoln. And on this coin, for the first time, were the words, "the Statue of Liberty." And whether or not he had the idea of a statue at this point, we have no idea, but he's honoring Abraham Lincoln here. In 1865, the ruler of France was Napoleon III. After the French Revolution, a monarchy and the empire of Napoleon Bonaparte, the first Napoleon, France became a monarchy again. And in 1848, there was an overthrow. This is the rebellion that you see in Les Mis when they're trying to get rid of the government. And Louis Napoleon had been elected president in 1848. And then in 1852, he held this kind of phony election and had himself elected emperor. Okay, so he's elected emperor. The French are kind of saying, you know, we want to relive the good old days. Napoleon III is Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew. So they are related, but not that closely related. But during this American Civil War, Napoleon III backed the Confederacy. Okay, he did not back the Union. He backed the Confederacy because he's looking to expand his control in the Americas. And he invades Mexico and sets up a Mexican empire, which is a puppet state of France. And he figured that the Confederates, first of all, the United States is busy with the war, so they're not going to interfere with him. And he figured that the Confederates would back him because he would be allowing slavery in that Mexican empire. So that the Confederates, if they won the Civil War, slavery would continue. They wouldn't mind having a slave country to the south of them. So he backs the Confederacy, and of course the Confederacy loses. And this concerns a number of French because, yeah, we backed the wrong side. And at the same time, in Europe, okay, 1865, war is over, we backed the wrong side, says France. But from 1865 to 1870, Prussia is beginning to unify those German states. Now, France felt rather safe because of where it was on the map. To the south of them was Spain. Well, and there were Pyrenees in the way, and Spain was kind of like, ho-hum, nobody's scared of Spain. Belgium, nobody cares. The Netherlands, nobody cares. Switzerland, surrounded by mountains. The Germans are so divided up into little states that they're not a danger. So that the only danger comes if Prussia can begin to unite them. And that's what Prussia is going to do. And in 1870, there is the Franco-Prussian War. This is the war that the Prussians manipulate Napoleon III to declare. Okay, this is a masterpiece of conniving. They do something that convinces Napoleon III that he and the French have been insulted. And so he declares war as a result. Okay, there was no reason for it. He just does it because he's humiliated. And the result is the Prussians in the years between 1866 and 1870 had come up with treaties with all of the German states. And the treaties were mutual defense treaties, that if any one of them were attacked, the others would come and help. So Prussia, which does have kind of is in pieces, Prussia says, you know, if France attacks Prussia, All of these other, Bavaria, the Thuringian states, Hesse, Holstein, Mecklenburg, they're all going to help defeat France. And in fact, 6 weeks, the French army is defeated, takes Paris 6 months before they surrender. This is a close-up of this map. This is actually a French map from 1870, and it will show you what they sort of thought about different countries. We've got France, and he's sort of trying to protect his borders there. Underneath, we've got Spain, and Spain is just sleeping, you know, don't really care. The Prussians are expanding outward. Look at Russia, okay? I'm not sure. They think it's big and scary. Norway and Sweden are coming down to eat up Denmark. And England, Britannia, the old witch, who's not looking at Europe, she's looking at Ireland, okay? She's trying to keep the Irish under control. Ireland is not an independent country at that point, but it's like a wildcat they're trying to keep under control. Turkey is sleeping. The Turkish part of Europe, the Balkans is screaming to get out. I'm not quite sure what Italy is doing, but this is, you know, this is how the world was, the French world was seen and how Europe was seen at that time. So the war is over, Germany wins, and this illustrates Germany, France's greatest fear. First of all, Germany was united under the Prussians. It becomes a, you know, Germany says the war was forced on us by the French. They declared war. Here's our losses. We've lost all these people. And the United States has also lost all these people. So they're drawn together by the losses from wars. And this is the French, like Le Bouillet, are saying, we've got to get back on the good side of the United States. We can't afford to lose them as friends. And you'll notice that America there is not shown as Uncle Sam, because at this point, people tended to use female figures as the representation of a country. Like Britannia, we use Columbia, this female figure. And when I was a kid, we sang Hail Columbia and Columbia, the gem of the ocean. I don't know that those songs are sung anymore. Today, we know that Statue of Columbia more like from the movies than anything else. But this kind of female representation of a country was very common at that point. So Le Bouillet is really concerned about this. And so he spends from 1870 to 1875, he undertakes this project to give a gift to the United States. And he goes public in September of 1875. They're going to build a statue, and the statue is going to be called Liberty Enlightening the World. And the French people are going to finance it, and the American people would have to find the location and pay for the pedestal. Now, work had already been done, money had already been raised, but not all of it. If any of you have ever been involved with a lot of fundraising, one of the things you do when you raise funds is you have a private quiet time before you go public, and so that when you go public, you can say, we already have 30% or 40% or 50% in hand. So Le Bouillet in 1875 says, we're going to build a statue, and it's going to be called Liberty Enlightening the World. And that is just a year before the Philadelphia Centennial, the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And this becomes, in his mind, he goes, aha, this is a great time. And he collects as much money as possible because he wants to make this statue a reality. Now, Le Bouillet is an idea man. He needs someone who can make a statue. And he says, I want this statue at the Philadelphia Centennial. Well, he doesn't make the whole statue, okay? Some of it gets there, but the only part of this statue that gets there is the arm, the hand, and the torch. They've raised enough money, they have enough material for that amount to be done. So there's a picture, and you'll see more of that later. But in order to make the statue, he can't do it, he's just the idea guy. He hires Frederick August Bartholdi. And Bartholdi, who comes from a wealthy family, they expected him to become an attorney. He is an artist, a sculptor, an architect, and he's a supporter of this project from the very beginning. He starts working on it about 1870, so 5 years before they went public. Because when they go public, they actually have a plan for what it's going to look like. Bartholdi loved big monuments. When he was 20 years old, he made this bronze statue for an international exposition in Paris. Now, he got the right to do it because of family connections. This statue was so tall that one, if it was 1 inch higher, he could not have gotten it out of his workshop. And two, it was too big to go inside the hall where it was supposed to be displayed. So it gets displayed outside, which probably is brilliant because some people didn't go inside the Hall of Sculptures. I don't want to see that statue, those statues, they all look alike. But because it was outside, so many people saw it and it gained attention. So from the age of 20, we know that this guy likes to do big pieces. Now, one of the statues that was there he did not do it, but it was a statue called France Crowning Arts and Industries, and it was built for this exposition in 1855. And you look at that and you kind of go, ooh, there are some things that are kind of familiar about that. He may have taken some inspiration from that. He's 20 years old. He and a group of friends begin to travel around Europe, getting inspiration, still studying, and he ends up in Egypt. His friends all leave and he stays. He's really entranced by what's going on in Egypt. But he's particularly entranced because this is when the Suez Canal is being built. The Suez Canal cut an enormous number of miles from the journey from Europe to Asia. You can see there on that one map, with the canal, it's a little over 7,000 miles. Without the canal, it's just over 12,000 miles. So it's approximately half the distance. Well, that's half the money, half the food, things are quicker. So he's really entranced by this building of the canal, particularly because the Egyptian government says they want to do a lighthouse at the mouth of the canal, kind of to replicate the kind of lighthouse that was at Alexandria in ancient times. We're looking for another wonder of the ancient world. And this is, Bartholdi says, whoa, this is right up my alley. And he begins to come up with some plans. And here's one sketch that he does and 3 models he has of his what he thinks this lighthouse might look like. Again, I think I've seen something like this before. The plan was that the crown of the figure would have the lights in it. And so he's ready to go. He thinks this is great. I'll build this for you. Just give me the material and the men and the money and I'm ready to go. And Egypt had no money. So these plans come to naught. But he ends up going back to France. He does smaller projects, commissions for people, does busts, small statues for gardens. He meets Le Bouillet. He becomes intrigued by this, and he likes the idea of creating something for the United States. He's on board. And so he says he comes up with a design, and Le Bouillet gives him money to travel to the United States. To do 2 things. 1, to find a location, and 2, to drum up support. So Bartholdi comes to the United States, and here's one of his sketches of what he thinks this statue might look like. You see it's getting closer and closer to what we see today. He goes for 6 months in the United States. He's looking for the right location. He goes to New York, to Boston, to Baltimore, Chicago, St. Louis, goes as far west as San Francisco. Everywhere he goes, he talks about building this unity between the United States and France. He helps form a committee in the United States to work on this. And the deal is that the French people will pay for the statue. The US has to come up with the location and the pedestal. And he thinks the perfect location is right there in New York Harbor. He's convinced that Bedloe Island is the right place. He's a good salesman. But this is his quote about the United States. America is an adorable woman chewing tobacco. Interesting picture. He goes back to France. He takes on small commissions because he has to, he wants to keep working. And he continues to drum up support for this statue, works it for Le Bouillet, talking about this as they come up with money, coming up with plans, finalizing things. Many Americans were kind of like, well, we don't know this guy. I mean, he wants to build this statue, but how good is he? And he does get a commission to do a statue of the Marquis de Lafayette. And this is in Union Square in New York City. And people look at it and they go, ooh, that's a nice statue. Well, if he can do this, then maybe that, freedom enlightening the world, liberty enlightening the world, maybe he can do a good job with that too. So back in France, they need money to build this statue. It's going to be huge, 150 feet high. That's a lot of metal. A lot of work has to go into it. They used the press. They had pictures. They did PR. They went to towns. They went to schools. They went to fraternal groups. This is not done by the government. There is no government support for this. This is all done by private contributions. They do get really lucky because the price of copper went down. It had to do with suddenly some copper was found. Somebody had hoarded lots of copper. It's now virtually worthless. And so the copper that they needed was donated. But they still didn't have enough to completely build this statue. In 1875, they had enough for the torch, the hand, and the arm. And then Bartoli does something that's brilliant. He patents the image. So it's his statue. He patents liberty enlightening the world. And then they sell it. They sell it in little trading cards that he autographs. They sell it. If there's a tchotchke, they sell it on the tchotchke. I mean, he sells this image and they use that money to build the statue. And so by the time you get to the Philadelphia Centennial in 1876, they arrive late because the mold had broken and they had to start over again. But they have the arm, the torch, the flame, the hand, and they put it on display. And for 50 cents, which is about $15 today, you could go up, okay? Oops, go back. Okay, see the people up here? Okay, you could go up and stand on that balcony. And so you paid your money, you got up, you got to look out at the Centennial, and you came down, and in order to get out, you had to go through the gift shop. Okay, I think all of you have been to a place like that. You have to go through the gift shop. And they sold scrap metal from making this. Think about this, you take the sweepings, the little leftover pieces, and then you sell them as souvenirs. They sold all sorts of tchotchkes, and they used that money. Now, if you went to the Centennial before the Statue of Liberty hand got there, there were other things to do. Heinz ketchup was introduced at this Centennial, and the first telephone was on display at this Centennial. I always have a kind of a fond spot in my heart for this because my great-grandfather, who was a recent immigrant to the United States and who lived outside Philadelphia, went to the exposition, and I have something that he purchased there that is passed down in the family, a piece of pottery. And if you want to see some of the things that were at this at the Centennial, if you go down to Washington, whenever anything opens up again, the Museum of Arts and Industry has many of the displays. They have the displays from each state. Each state had a display, and that is still on display in Washington. So once the Centennial closes, they move this to New York. They do the same thing. They've raised money. And this convinces Congress, this is so popular, it convinces Congress that maybe this is not such a far-fetched idea. Now, there's no money going to come from Congress, but the location that Bartholdi wanted belonged to the US government. It was an island called Bedloe Island, and he thought it would be ideal. It's right in New York Harbor. And Bedloe Island, fascinating story. Bedloe Island is in New Jersey waters, but it belongs to New York. At least everything that is above, everything that is land at high tide. If it's low tide, then some of that land belongs to, and the land underwater belongs to, actually, let's reverse it. At low tide, whatever, New Jersey and New York are fighting over it. Today it is run by the National Trust, and so it's a moot point. But this has to do with a really weird colonial treaty that normally in colonial times, you would divide this space right down the middle, and they didn't. They did this kind of weird loop. And so the water is New Jersey, but the land is New York. So on this island, there had been a fort built in the War of 1812. It had more or less been abandoned. During the Civil War, they had used it as a recruitment area, but it really, nobody was there. But this is what Bartholdi thought would be the perfect spot. And Congress decides, okay, this is a good idea. We will donate the island. So all the Americans have to do now, they have a location, it's been given to them. All they have to do is come up with the money for the pedestal. Meanwhile, back in France, Bartholdi is building the head. And they set the head up in Paris once it's done. And you could rent out the head for dinner parties. And again, you have the same sort of thing. You know, you can buy your souvenirs there. This is how they used it to raise more money. They gave tours of the factory. There was a national lottery to raise money, and everything possible to raise money. And finally, by 1880, it was fully funded in France. They had enough money, they had the copper. They just have a couple of little problems. Okay, the United States has the island, but it doesn't have, you know, it doesn't have the pedestal. But the big problem in France was this is a 150-foot statue, and it's on an island in a harbor. It's going to have to stand up to winds. There are going to be temperature variations. New York in August, New York in January, great extremes in temperatures. The outside is copper, but the framework is going to be iron, and copper and iron in certain conditions are going to create electricity, which would turn this statue into a 150-foot battery. Yeah, we have a problem. Bartholdi is a sculptor. He is not an engineer. It's going to take an engineer to figure out how to build this. The first engineer says, you know, why don't we just fill the thing up with sand? Okay, fill it with sand. That will stop the electricity. It won't blow over. It's going to be a good thing. Well, that guy dies, and so Bartholdi has to go find another engineer, and he finds a young man who's been building railroad bridges. And that guy is Gustav Eiffel, long before his tower. Okay, so we have Bartoli has this idea of what the statue is going to look like, but Eiffel has to figure out the engineering of how you're going to do this. And what he does is he comes up with an iron framework inside with these arms coming out to like the bones of a skeleton. And the copper is going to hang on it rather than sort of being firmly fastened. As I was thinking about this, the best analogy I could come up with is I remember in science labs, particularly biology labs, there would be a skeleton, okay? You'd have the skeleton hanging in the corner. And rather than dressing the skeleton in clothes, trying to make it look like it's, you know, a human, somebody throws a sheet over it. That's kind of what Eiffel said we're going to do. And so this is his plan. Here's this iron framework that he's going to come up with, and the copper just sort of hangs from it. And all the joints between the copper and the iron will have cloth or asbestos between them. So this is the plan that Eiffel comes up with. The Bouillet has the idea, Bartoli has the design, and Eiffel gives you the engineering that makes it possible. So they have the plan, they have the money, they have the copper, they figured out the engineering problem, and they start building. And this is the scene in Paris. Get to watch this growing over the city. And of course, you know, lots of photographers, and they're going to come, and it's going to be in newspapers and magazines all over the world. So everybody gets to watch this. And by 1883, the statue is done. And the US wasn't ready. They have the island, but they don't have any money for the pedestal. Now, at this point, San Francisco says, well, we'll take it. Baltimore says, we'll take it. Boston says, we'll take it. Washington even offers to take it, although Washington is having its own problems with building. They had started the Washington Monument and then stopped the building of it just before the Civil War. You can see how far it got. And it wasn't until the centennial in 1875, almost 20 years after the original construction stopped, that they continued building the Washington Monument. And even though the marble came from exactly the same quarry, it's different because it's from a different level of the quarry. And depending on the lighting, you can tell when you see the Washington Monument that you've got this definite line around it with the two different kinds of marble. Now, Washington did finish the Washington Monument in 1885. And at that time, it was the tallest building in the world at 555 feet and 5.18 inch. Okay, but they were convinced it had to be New York. And so the committee gets together, it comes up with a plan. It's going to build the pedestal on top of the remains of the fort. It's got to have a really deep foundation. We've got a 150-foot statue, which is going to go on top of this. But and they start building this even before they have all the money for construction. They've got to get moving on it. They do all they can to publicize this in magazines, you know, get donations. But it takes, they even use Bartoli. He signs these cards. We've got the statue, Liberty Enlightening the World, little, you know, here's a souvenir, he signs it. This, about 2 years ago, sold for just under $2,000 on eBay. But they did everything possible to raise money. They even considered advertising. Remember, they own, Bartoli owns the rights to this. And although this is a cartoon, suggesting that maybe you put, you know, signs for corn relief by the feet and liquor and umbrellas and hats and everything else, there actually was a children's, a company that made medicine for children that offered to pay for the pedestal in entirety if they could put their advertising on the pedestal, because everybody would see it coming in and out of the harbor. The medicine was a laxative, and they decided they would turn it down. But they did have these advertising cards. And on one side, you would have the statue. On the other side, you would have advertising for a product. This happens to be for nickels, bark, and iron. It is for clergymen, counselors, journalists, and all persons of sedentary habits. I think that involves all of us right now. I love this. It is an iron tonic. It's good for nervous prostration, headache, etc. If your nerves are shattered, if you're subject to fits of depression or nervous excitement, you should take this. I did try to find out what this was made of. Obviously some kind of bark, probably cherry bark, probably with an alcohol base. Most of these were either alcohol base or an opiate base. But anyway, so it's a never failing remedy. So this is passed out as an advertising card, and obviously nickels, bark, and iron would contribute money to the pedestal. And notice that on top, the light just leads right up here to nickels, bark, and iron. Some people thought that it may have gone a little bit too far. This is a somewhat later cartoon, but it sort of fits into that. But what was this doing to the Liberty? How do we get this money? This is when we have Joseph Pulitzer entering. Joseph Pulitzer is one of two newspaper tycoons. Hearst was one, Pulitzer was the other. They are in competition with each other to control the news media world. And he, when he realizes that the pedestal committee is out of money, France has already boxed up and the statue and it's about ready to put it on ships, sending it over here. He says, we got to get moving on this. He was able to raise over $100,000 in 6 months. That's more than $2.6 million today. And most of the donations were less than $1. How did he do that? Donate money, get your name in the paper. Okay? More money you give, the bigger the print it is. I mean, it's just really publicity. Become famous, put your name in the paper. And with Pulitzer's backing, the pedestal finally gets finished. The boat arrives from France. And now they're going to have to put it together because they took it apart to ship it over here. And you can see with the workman here, you can see the size of the feet. Now, the Statue of Liberty was designed, or eventually got approved. One of the reasons the government gave the money for it was that it was going to be used as a lighthouse. Bartoli thought that they would put floodlights on this balcony. The people who put this together are basically immigrants, which is kind of interesting. And it really is a giant jigsaw puzzle. You put up the framework and then you put on these pieces of copper. And so in October of 1886, Liberty, enlightening the world, is open to the public. But in order for it to become a lighthouse, the Army Corps of Engineers said the flame has to have holes in it. Bartoli wanted the lights to be on this balcony area, okay, where the people are standing here. Army Corps of Engineers said, no, got to be here. So they cut holes. This is solid here. They cut holes in this to turn it into a lighthouse. Now, it served as a lighthouse for 16 years. It wasn't really very effective, didn't produce enough light. The torch was closed in 1916. A terrorist tried to blow it up. The original torch is now inside the museum, and And what you have on the outside, what you actually see is a replica of the torch. It's made out of copper and it's covered with 14 karat gold. Now, Thomas Edison had an interesting idea. He wanted to put a giant phonograph inside. And he thought that it should record speeches that would be, issued out in a loud enough tone that people in New York and New Jersey could hear this. Can you imagine having this statue talking to you? It's really scary. No one took him very seriously, thankfully. Just general statistics, it's 151 feet, 1 inches tall. Well, that kind of depends on the weather because the metal expands and contracts. Her mouth is 3 feet wide. The copper that covers all of this is less than the thickness of 2 pennies. Okay, it's literally just a sheet of copper that has been molded on here. It does sway. The statue itself sways up to 3 inches. The torch sways up to 6 inches if it's 50 miles an hour winds. I'm not sure what happens when a hurricane comes. I'm not sure. I want to find out. It was, as it conceived by Le Bouillet, it is liberty enlightening the world. We say the Statue of Liberty, but liberty enlightening the world. And you don't see this detail because it's too big and too far up. But underneath her feet are chains, which her feet have smashed. Liberty is smashing the things that chain people up. To Le Bouillet, it was slavery, but other people saw it as other things that were keeping people from being free. This symbol of liberty, when it was opened, there was the first ticker tape parade in New York. The parade started in New York, and then people went down, and there was a water parade of 300 boats that went by. Now, I will tell you, it was a rainy, foggy day, and there was very limited visibility. The statue was unveiled. There had been a large piece of canvas that was covered with the French flag placed over her face, and they actually unveiled it during the ceremony. There were somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 people at this ceremony, all of them men. No women were allowed at this ceremony. They claimed it was because it was still a construction site and there were too many rocks and dangerous things, and women could not safely walk around. Emily Post, remember Emily Post, who told us what our manners were? Emily Post's father was an architect who worked on this, and when she was a little girl, and she actually was at the dedication ceremony because her father was there, but she was about 7 years old. The New York State Women's Suffrage Association, which was furious that women were not allowed to go. Here is this woman celebrating liberty and they aren't allowed to go there. They chartered a special boat to get as close to possible to see the ceremonies from the water. But this statue obviously has become a symbol around the world. Just a few years after the Statue of Liberty, or Liberty Enlightening the World, was unveiled in New York, a replica of it, a 1/4 size replica, was placed in Paris to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution, and it's still there today. And you can get, a picture with their Statue of Liberty and the Eiffel Tower in the background. There are copies all over the world. Lynn?
Yeah, the one on the left, it looks like it's a reverse image. Is that just the photograph?
It is a reverse image. They did the reverse.
Okay, thank you.
The one on the lower right-hand corner, well, that's in Las Vegas. Okay, why not? And that leads us to the great postage stamp debacle. Okay, on the right, we have liberty enlightening the world. On the left, we have liberty telling you to spend more money in Vegas. In 2010, the US Postal Service issued a new stamp on which they had the face of Lady Liberty. Only they didn't have the Lady Liberty, the real Lady Liberty. They had the Vegas Lady Liberty, which was a violation of copyright. It cost them $3.5 million. But the scary thing is, it took 4 months before anybody noticed that it was the wrong face. Okay, but so US Postal Service at work. Certainly it was influential in the statue that was put up in Tiananmen Square. And we know that Lady Liberty is definitely a symbol of our country. And we've come to associate her with the work of Emma Lazarus. Now, Emma Lazarus was from a very wealthy Jewish family who had lived in New York City for a long time. She worked with immigrants, and while they were doing the fundraising, they had an art exhibit, and she was asked to compose a poem for this art exhibit. And, you know, not like a brazen giant of Greek fame. She, a mighty woman whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, her name, the mother of exiles. Keep your ancient lands, your storied pomp, she cries. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. And we have this on the Statue of Liberty, and yet this is certainly a topic which has caused great conversations, discussions, arguments in the past and in the present. We've not always been welcoming to people from outside. In the 1850s, the American Party, that's what it was called, the American Party, also known as the Know Nothing Party, because when they were asked about anything, they knew nothing. They were against immigration. They were against foreigners of all kinds. And here we have a cartoon. You know, we're against the Irish and against the Germans. The Irish are associated with whiskey, they're drinkers. The Germans, beer, drinkers. And notice what they're carrying off with them. They're stealing the ballot box. Okay, they're stealing the ballot box because you've got the election in the background, and you're going, you know, they're causing all of this fighting and disagreements in this country. By the 1890s, we've got poor old Uncle Sam. There's the danger to American ideas and institutions with the riffraff of immigration. This is called the high tide of immigration is a national menace. And I'm not sure, you know, how big your screens are, but the faces on these people are, you know, the villains. You know, think about the villains. They're all the villains. And here's Uncle Sam frantically trying to protect the American ideals. Also in the 1890s, we've got Uncle Sam, and we've got coming direct from the slums of Europe daily. We've got people, they've got knives in their teeth, they're the mafia, they're rats, they're all you know, they're rats with faces, and Uncle Sam is standing there, you know, what am I gonna do? We're being overrun by these rats. This is terrible. By the 1920s, we had taken steps. We're going to limit who's coming in. We're not gonna just let everybody in. We're gonna put in quotas. We're going to only let some people in. 1925, we are God's own country. And we want, you know, look at the Bolsheviks, the Indians, the Chinese. Now, In 1925, Russia, the communists are just taking over. People are fighting against communists. People are fleeing communism, the coming of communism. Well, we don't want them here. India is somewhat in chaos. China is in chaos. They are, we don't want you here because, you got bugs on you and you're just, terrible people. And so, because this is God's own country, we don't want you because you're also not good Christians, I guess. One magazine had this cover, and they proposed this solution to immigrants. If you're going to let them all come, if the Statue of Liberty is saying, I lift up my lamp, let them all come, just let them stay all on Liberty Island, just dump them there. So, Statue of Liberty. I think it was liberty, Le Bouillet said it was liberty enlightening the world. He saw the United States as an example to the rest of the world of what freedom should be. Now, when it was put up, there were a lot of people who didn't feel that liberty. In the South, the newly freed slaves are now being kept down by black codes. Segregation is coming full force. Women feel like they don't have any rights. They don't have the right to vote. It was only in 1870 that a law was passed that allowed married women to own their own property. Up until that point, a woman basically couldn't own property. It was owned by her husband or it was owned by her father. So this is it was an ideal. We weren't necessarily there. I spent one summer in a course for teachers, which was a mixture of teachers from the United States and China. And one of the Chinese teachers there always would say, China has come a long way, but China has a long way to go. And I think if we look at the Statue of Liberty or Liberty Enlighten the World, we have come a long way. We still have a ways to go. And she represents sort of the best freedoms, and that someone thought, the French thought anyway, that we were an example to the world of what freedom and liberty should be. So there we go.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank
How
you,
many of
Kathleen.
you